Alright, hello to everyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today I'm going to be doing another discussion video and starting another series, and it's going to be the set review of the unreleased Eye of the Storm Kaijudo set. So before I get started, I'll just kind of talk about what I'm going to do with this series. So I was hoping to maybe do it in one longer video where I just go through the whole set, or maybe do a separate video for the super rares, but to be honest, I was having some trouble recording the videos and some errors with like the longer form stuff with my computer. It hasn't been my laptop hasn't been doing too well with the videos lately, which is part of why I haven't had the face cam going in some of my recent dual videos either. So I decided instead to just do a series of shorter videos. So I'm going to be doing one video for each of the civilizations, going through the commons, uncommons, and rares. I'll have a video for the multi-civs, and then I'll probably have a little bit of a longer video at the end where I'll cover the 5 super rares and maybe go into a little bit more detail, because a lot of these super rares are build-arounds. So I might show off a few of the decks that I've had been experimenting with some of the super rares in that video, and I might cap it off with maybe a list of the top 10 cards. I'm not sure if it's going to be the most powerful cards or what I think are the best, or maybe just the cards I'm most excited about using. But that'll be sort of the idea. So there'll probably be maybe 6 or 7 videos total across the series, and there'll be hopefully some shorter videos. The other thing that I want to point out too is before I get started is I'll probably talk about the cards mostly in a vacuum, just discussing how powerful they are in general. But when I contextualize it to a format, it will probably be for the open format. I'm not going to talk too much about standard. I might mention standard here or there, but for the most part, standard is just not a format I've paid much attention to. At least not since the game has died, to be honest. I've mostly just focused on experimenting and brewing within the open card pool. I haven't had much interest or even enjoyment out of the standard format. So again, I might mention it here or there where I think it's especially relevant, but for the most part, I'm going to be discussing these cards in the context of open. So keep that in mind as I go through the set review. So I think with that all laid out, we can jump into the first card here in the light section. So we have Arcane Glider, 3 mana, 2000 power, and it gets a bonus of 2000 power every time you cast a spell. So, I mean, not a super relevant creature type, unfortunately. Mainly looking for enforcers there, but I suppose the idea of this card is it would be a nice card to pair with things like Spark Cage or Containment Field as just cheap tap effects, and this can be a big body with those. But it still gets outsized by a lot in the early game. It still can't get over Aqua Strider with 1 spell cast. On top of that, it doesn't really work well, or it gets outsized as well by things like Dawnblaze Patrol, Lost Patrol, even especially Swordhorned. It's just getting outsized by a lot of those cards, and you might as well just use those if you're playing a Piercing Judgment deck rather than hoping to pair this card with them. And it's a lot worse on the defensive side because your opponent can use their piercings really effectively against Arcane Glider when it doesn't have the bonus. So just not really a card that's going to be seeing constructed play, unfortunately. Next up we have Citadel Cruiser, another sort of common card, 5 mana, 4500 power. If you meet the condition of having 2 or fewer shields, it taps something, but not really anything redeeming about this card here. So we'll just move on from that. Next up, I guess a card we can talk a little bit more about, Deflector Pod. So the key thing here is that it's a 2-drop enforcer, so right away you're looking at a potential bait card for Blinder Beetle Prime. So 2500 power, and when it blocks, you may choose one of your other creatures that doesn't have blocker and untap it. So I guess the strength of this card would be if you're trying to protect one of your tapped creatures, this can effectively block all of your opponent's creatures from killing it. So if you have like an important creature in play and your opponent has and it's tapped and your opponent has 3 creatures, If they attack with the first one, normally you would just have to let that tapped creature die that you control. But with Deflector Pod, you can just chump block with the Deflector Pod, or maybe even trade off, and then defend that creature by untapping it from all the other creatures your opponent controls. But overall, these kinds of tap effects and untap effects that are on all these cheap light cards, they always appear somewhat. They rarely come up that effectively. They're just not really a huge deal, in my opinion. Especially with this one, your opponent has a lot of the choice over sort of how it ends up playing out in the game. So I'm not a big fan of this card. It has to block it. So yeah. Comparing it to the other options as well, is just where it gets really outclassed. If you're looking at a deck like Monolite Rush, they're just gonna play any like attacking 2-drop Enforcer anyways, and they're gonna play Chasm Entangler as a 1-drop. If you're looking at something like, let's say like a more controlling deck, maybe one that's using Blinder Beetle Prime where you want Deflector Pod. I mean, they have Strider, they have Lemon, they have even, again, I would probably play Chasm Entangler before this. And the big comparison is like, I think Chasm Entangler is just a clearly better card. 1 mana is a much better effect than an extra 500 power and this sort of maybe relevant sometimes, maybe not kind of ability. So like if I'm playing something like Bant or Light Water Nature Mega Bugs or Light Water Nature Tempo, I'm going to be looking at Chasm Entangler and Strider there. And bottom line is this card's maybe much more comparable to Raincloud Kraken, and that card is already, in my opinion, proven to be a worse card than Chasm Entangler and sort of been pushed out of the format. Like Raincloud was definitely relevant in Standard because you didn't have Chasm, so it was sort of the second Enforcer 2-drop that you could either pair with Stingwing or Aqua Strider depending on what colors you were playing. But in Open, this card is just kind of both this card and Raincloud Kraken. You could debate which of those 2 cards is better. This card might be better than Raincloud with the extra effect. 2,500 power is proven to be kind of enough in my mind in the early game. What is it? Ironwill Tree is just a fine stat line as a cheap blocker. So if you want the Enforcer tag over the much more relevant ability of Ironwill Tree, you could play Deflector Pod. I'm not too sure though. The next card is another vanilla creature. We have Disaster Drone. Not really worth talking about here. Feathered Malteal is the next creature. We have a 6 mana 5,500 power blocker skirmisher. And whenever it enters, clash with your opponent. If you win the clash, tap target enemy creature. So, this card, not really getting there in constructed. Unfortunately, the art's amazing. Looks like something even like out of an anime like Evangelion almost. Could have been cool on like an actual Celestial Dragon. Like if this was Lyra's art, it would be. I mean, Lyra has decent art, but this card looks incredible. So, unfortunately, not really getting there. Maybe a blocker, like just a nice blocking Skyforce champion is relevant, but I'm pretty sure there's already. I want to call like Sunwhip Sentry or something like that. I think there's already a blocking Skyforce champion. So, no idea if this card would be relevant for that archetype. But it's just kind of a bad card. Like, compare this to Lyra outright. Like, it's just so much worse. You have to win the clash for it to do stuff. Probably a decent limited card, though, for sure. Or a good limited card, I should say. So, next up, Haven's Council. This is probably the most exciting card, definitely so far. It's the first in a cycle of these 8 mana 6k double breakers where if you meet a specific condition, they cost 4 fewer mana. So there's a couple different places I could see potential for this card. The first would be a Skyforce Champion archetype. Now I might be speaking out of turn here because I haven't actually really experimented with those decks, but I know like these kind of Haven's Elite, Dawnbreaker Jazuri, is that what its name is? No, that's not its name, but whatever that card is, the Skyforce Champion Evolution, the Haven's Elite, those kinds of Skyforce Champion decks, I know people have a soft spot for those kind of archetypes, trying to make those work. And I can only imagine like a 4 mana 6,000 power Skyforce Champion goes a long way for that archetype. That said, I'm not going to say that's going to be ever a good deck even with this card. It's not really my field of expertise to be playing those archetypes, but I would imagine it's a good add for those decks. It kind of can play the role as almost like an Ardu Cloud Strider, but much better, because the problem with Ardu is like it can try to stabilize the board by just having this really cheap, huge body. But the difference is Ardu, you can't just, once you take control of the battlefield, you can't just turn the corner with Ardu Cloud Strider. It's just kind of sitting there doing nothing. Whereas Haven's Council, once it kind of stabilizes the board and you can add some other cards to your board, it can actually just turn the corner and kill your opponent as a giant double breaker. So much more effective at that. So on top of that, you're just going to be curving blockers into it, gives you a threat that rewards you, or that lets you balance out your position, so you're not just playing blockers and more blockers. Now you can play blockers and double breakers, so it could be nice for like a Skyforce Champion archetype. The other place that's probably a more competitive deck to look at, maybe including this card, would be Monolite Rush, which let's just save for when we entertain the card. Let's just assume that there's a build that can adequately support it first, and kind of discuss why I think this card would be valuable for Monolite Rush to at least look at. So at first, it's got the downside of this card compared to some of the 4-drop evos like Sparkblade Protector and Prism Blade Ascendant is it's a much slower card. Like those cards would come down right away, attack on turn 4. This card won't attack till turn 5 if you play it on curve. So that's one downside, where it's a little bit slower. But there's a benefit too, where you don't have to swallow up your bait creatures you don't have to swallow up like your 3-drop or your 2-drop from your board position just to upgrade to that big creature. Like you can have both. But I mean, the subtle downside there is that the creatures that you have in play, if you're curving into this, are going to be blockers, which most likely can't attack. So that's kind of a trade-off there. So it has some downsides, but I think the key upsides to Haven's Council is that it's like that kind of 4-mana double breaker, big body that doesn't die to Bone Blades and can't be blocked by Scared Orb of Gloomhollow. And while I've been playing Monolite Rush, and especially I've actually played the deck a little bit more recently too, the deck is really good against a lot of the other sort of aggressive rush decks for sure, but it really struggles in one part, especially against darkness decks. Like things with Bone Blades and Gloomhollow can be super difficult to deal with, because Bone Blades is just such an effective card against your evos. Gloomhollow can be really tough to deal with outside of maybe Blinder Beetle Prime later on. But like you have Blinder Beetle to tap the Gloomhollow in the early turns, but Gloomhollow just sits around and invalidates your evolutions a lot of the time. And paired with Bone Blades, it can be really backbreaking. So I found the darkness decks to be a bit of a problem, and Haven's Council could go a long way to addressing some of those issues. So it's definitely worth exploring because of that. But kind of looping back to the condition of the card, I'm just not sure there's really the cards there to support this card for Monolite Rush, because you can't really ever afford to have this card be dead or not live when you have the option to play cards like Sparkblade Protector or Prism Blade Ascendant instead, because you're probably going to have to cut one of those cards to fit Haven's Council in your list. So you can't really afford to have this card be dead. So I mean, pretty clearly you're probably going to still play Chasm Entangler, because no matter what, because it's either like a 1-drop that can support Haven's Council, or it's a 1-drop bait for your evolutions, and you're probably going to play it no matter what. Then you have Sparkblade Protector, which is the 2-mana 3500 power blocker that if you're playing Monolite, so that card's really good at supporting Haven's Council. But after that, you're going to just have to be playing like some more skirmish blockers. I think the one card that could be interesting, I forget the name of it, but there's the 3-mana 3500 power skirmisher, where if you control an evolution creature, it can attack. But so I could see curves where like maybe you play like the ideal curve would be like 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop blocker, turn 4 Haven's Council, and then on turn 5 you could evolve your 2-drop into like maybe a Blinder Beetle Prime or one of the other evolution creatures, and then you can attack, and then everything but or you could evolve your Chasm Entangler, sorry, you don't have to evolve the 2-drop. Like you could even miss your 2-drop in this curve, just like play a Chasm Entangler over the first couple turns, play the 3-mana 3500 power blocker, play Council, then play an evolution on the Chasm, and now everything on your field can attack. So that's kind of appealing. So maybe that card's good, But the problem is, I believe that card's a Storm Patrol, so I don't know how that would work, because you're probably still, like, you could definitely play Prism Blade Ascendant, which I think is a better card than Sparkblade Protector already, but like, you're probably still going to want to play Blinder Beetle Prime, so you're still going to want to have majority Enforcers. Maybe there's enough that you can afford to play the Skirmish blocker guy, the 3 mana one, but that card can lead to some inconsistencies as well. But at the same time, I mean, you don't have to cast it unless you already have Haven's Council good to go. But the problem is, if you're putting those in your mana, then your Haven's Councils run the risk of being dead cards in the later game as top decks, which can be really backbreaking, as opposed to just drawing these evolution cards that are just powerful fast attacks that you can just drop out of your hand. So I think there's a lot of downsides. I'm not really sure if the builds of this deck to support it can get there, but it's one of the more exciting cards in the light section in terms of actually trying to explore it and see if it's viable, because I think there's potential there. Because like I said, the fact that it's an 8 cost can go a long way to addressing some of the cards that are issues for mono light. So worth exploring for sure. Next card, we have Havoc Sphere. So 4 mana 4K, you clash when it enters the battle zone, and if you win, you can cast a spell that's level 5 or less from your hand for free. So, I mean, it can be a big tempo swing. One of the more powerful things you can probably do is just play an Oathsworn Call and drop like a Lyra or a Finbar alongside this. But outside of that, you might just play it and then play a Piercing or something. It just generates some extra mana, which is nice, but the problem is you have to win the clash to do it, and it's just not going to be worth playing a card that only does this effect like half the time or whatever it ends up being. Like, it's just probably not worth playing this card in your deck. On top of that, if you're trying to build around it, it's just not really worth building around these clash cards when they're just not going to be effective all the time. And on top of that, beyond just like approaching it from a deck building perspective, you also have to discuss like the lines of play that you take. Like, if this card is in your deck, like a lot of the time you're just not even going to be wanting to take these lines of play where you hold your Oathsworn Call, you hold your big, I mean, you're probably going to hold your Lyra or Finbar anyways, but like holding your Havoc Sphere, holding your Oathsworn Call, and making that play, taking lines of play that save all those cards in your hand, maybe taking early turns off to facilitate this, just to whiff on the Havoc Sphere, is kind of a bummer. On top of that, like, this card is meaning to make big tempo pushes by getting you that extra mana. Otherwise, you might as well just not play the Havoc Sphere and just cast the 5-drop spells or 4-drop spells that you're casting off of Havoc Sphere. So you might as well just play the spells themselves if those cards are important to your strategy. So the reason you'd want to play the body of Havoc Sphere as well is because you're trying to leverage that extra tempo and extra mana, so you're developing your board while casting these spells at the same time. So in order to really properly leverage that, you also need to be curving out. Like, you want to have a 2-drop, you want to have a 3-drop into Havoc Sphere so that you're actually leveraging that tempo push. But it can be, because of that, when you're trying to balance your mana decisions and your curve to do this, it's kind of hard to also set up these Havoc Sphere plays. And again, it all comes down to the clash just being hard to build around and play towards when it just runs the risk of whiffing half the time. So not really a fan of this card overall, but kind of a cool effect. So next up, we have Hoverstar, another more interesting card. So this is a Shield Blast blocker skirmisher, 2000 power but 8 mana, and it has the effect when it becomes tapped for the first time each turn, you untap all your other creatures that have blocker. So I mean, the floor of just a Shield Blast defensive card is pretty high, although this is one of the more low impact ones, especially compared to things like Sumo Artichoke that exist in other colors. But I mean, as well, we could even look at there's a Gauntlet card. There's like a 5 mana 2500 power Shield Blast skirmish blocker, and that card just doesn't see play. So there's not really a precedent for something like Hoverstar to be a valuable card. I think the big place you would want to look to this card is like abusing it with Haven. It's just a big block, or it's an expensive blocker you can drop alongside Haven, and it has some decent synergy with that card as well, where you can try to attack multiple times by maybe tapping your opponent's stuff, skirmish attacking over their their creatures to get double attacks with Haven. So there's some play there. On top of that, I mean, it can be a nice shield blast if you already have something like Strider or Lemon out, but those are kind of iffy spots because your opponent's breaking through your shields, through those blockers, and then you hit a Hover Star. So they have to kind of be chump attacking into the Strider in those cases. So it's kind of speculative to come up. But if you do control this card in a Strider, or maybe even your opponent hits this Hover Star in the early game and then you cast a Strider, all of a sudden your board can be hard to attack through because now you have like multiple, like you can chump block with the Hover Star after already blocking with Strider. But again, it comes down to this thing, like if your opponent's just playing Giant Anjax, like they're just going to be blocking in order to get multiple blocks out of the Strider, like it has to be surviving. So if you're just facing down huge creatures and chump blocking, this card doesn't really have an effect. So sort of a tricky card to evaluate. One of the really cool features of this card, though, it's almost like if you're playing the pile mirrors, this card can almost be like anti-Andromeda tech, where if your opponent is sitting behind like an Andromeda the Citadel, they put out multiple shields. If you control a Haven, what you can do, you can make some really disgusting plays where you attack with Haven. You could even just draw and put a Hover Star into play, and then you can tap the Hover Star to Awestrike from your opponent's Andromeda, and then you can untap the Eternal Haven, and then after its attack finishes and goes through, bearing like you don't hit something like a Stormspark Blast, you can attack a second time with Haven. If you have a second Hover Star, you can run this play again, and you can attack as many times as you have Hover Stars, which is actually a pretty sweet interaction. To where you can kind of just blow your opponent out if they go casting Andromedas against the pile. So that could be a pretty cool feature. You could also just set up plays where, like, if your opponent does that into your Haven, you can Crystal Memory out a Hover Star, search it up, and then make these attacks. If you have double Crystal Memory even, that could be really, really disgusting, where you set up double Hover Star and just pop off. So those kinds of lines of play to where it gives you some extra power, like can be a pretty powerful card in some spots in the late game, especially as like a 6k blocker to just drop alongside Haven with this effect, alongside Haven as a 6k. It just makes it really, really tough to your opponent to attack through because you're just getting multiple blocks out of Haven. Hover Star can eat tons of stuff on its own. If you have double Hover Star out, they can't untap each other infinitely because it's only the first time, which makes sense. But even then, it's just infinitely hard to break through Eternal Haven. Another bonus of this card alongside Haven is it insulates you against something like Stormspark Blast, because a lot of the times, like if you don't have an Andromeda out and you're trying to land Haven to stabilize, a lot of times in those games, like your opponent could be just sitting on a Stormspark Blast to make that final push through your shields. But Hover Star insulates you from that, because if they try to blast Hover Star, it just will untap the Haven. So there are some applications to this card in the late game, which is really nice, but the ultimate thing going against this card, I should finish that last thought. There's a lot of stuff going for it in the late game, and it's also just the floor of just like a Shield Blast defensive card. Even if it's like a kind of underwhelming 2000 power blocker, it's still a fine blast to hit against aggro decks, especially like the more linear rush decks. So it's got application there. The ultimate problem though is it's like a big expensive light card that's like another light mana, which you don't need too many of because that's like the main color in a lot of these pile decks. Hard to justify playing even more top end stuff like that. Especially over other better defensive blasts and better interaction from hand and better cards that play to your early game plan, which is like one of the things you want to do, because at the end of the day, the late game of Andromeda Haven plus like Squillis and Cassiopeia, that's kind of strong enough. I don't know if you really need to go to Hover Star to make these kind of cute plays, which is sort of the ultimate issue with this card, is it might be overkill for the late game and underkill in the early game. So yeah, overall, I don't really think this card would end up seeing play, but it has some really cool applications. So next up we have Nimbus Regents Envoy. So 5 mana, 4000 power, enters the battle zone, tap something, and will reveal for a clash the card is level 10. So kind of a neat effect. I just don't think it's really going to get there in terms of constructed. I mean, Homunculon's a good card, and it's a 5 mana 3k that taps something and an enforcer. But that card's also a mega bug, so it's like it's doing double duty in terms of card type, and that's one of the big reasons it sees a lot of play. On top of that, giving the bonuses can't be understated how important that can be for getting over large evos, and by amplifying things like Swordhorn, letting your creatures win in mirror matches, helping you attack over heralds and stuff. Like the extra 3,000 power is super relevant on Homunculon, even though that card's a multi-civ, which can be a bit of a downside sometimes, but also an upsides in other areas. But I just don't think Regents Envoy really gets there, because I just don't think, like, it could be a decent card if none of these other cards existed, but I just don't really see a home for this place. Like, more mid-rangey versions of just like straight mono white just don't really exist. I don't think this card really gets there. It's a little too underwhelming. You'd probably rather just play the more efficient Blinder Beetle itself if you're going to go this direction. And if you want a tapper and you can't play Homunculon, you're probably just going to play Blinder Beetle. So the Clash part of the card I don't think is particularly good either. I mean, these Clash decks I just don't really have any faith in to begin with. And this card is sort of like, it demonstrates another issue with these Clash decks as a whole, where like the Clash has a lot of inherent issue, like I addressed, where you're trying to build around it, and it's just, you're building around this like percent chance that you just fail, and you're taking lines of play around this percent chance that you just fail. And then you can address that by putting a bunch of high cost cards, or cards like this that are lower cost cards but are treated like high cost cards. And you're filling your deck with you could fill your deck with this stuff to facilitate the Clash. But now, like, you've kind of diminished some of the risk of Clash, but at the downside of just diluting your deck with probably a bunch of cards that are just a little more on the underwhelming side in general. So I just don't think, like, this card's just kind of an underwhelming card for constructed. And so, like, you're making up ground on the Clash errors of your deck, but now you're just playing a more just bad deck outside of the Clash issue. So yeah, I just think it just leads to a lot of problems. So not really a card I'm interested in. Next up, we have Photon Snare here. So 6 mana Shield Blast, tap a creature. If it's your turn, you can tap 2 enemy creatures instead. So obviously not really a good card for constructed. I mean, we have Helios Wings from Evo Fury or Helios Rings, that just Shield Blast taps 2 all the time, and it's 5 mana. So that card's just pretty much strictly better than this. But what I do want to say about this kind of card, and the whole cycle of these Shield Blasts that do more on your turn than on your opponent's, I think they're a really awesome design for the limited format, because when you're balancing limited, you want a healthy amount of just strong interaction and kind of control tools and just interaction in general. You want a healthy amount of strong interaction. And then you also need a healthy amount of Shield Blasts, because you don't want the game to just be like, you want some counterplay, and you want to have these kind of Shield Blast changes in tempo, and you want to have it so that you can't just like beat face by just curving out without much challenge, because there aren't enough Shield Blasts in the format. So you need to balance those two things. But one of the problems there is if you just tack Shield Blast onto those powerful interactive cards, then the Shield Blasts are too good, and then all of a sudden it's really difficult to justify attacking. So you can't really go that direction too hard. And then if you decide, well, we'll have a bunch of strong interaction that's not Shield Blast, and then a bunch of other interaction that's weaker but is Shield Blast, then maybe you just have way too much interaction in the format, and that's not healthy either. So walking the tightrope where you just have, like, you just kind of consolidate all into these powerful interactive spells that are powerful on your turn as just interaction, but then on your opponent's turn, they're just kind of like the weaker Shield Blasts. Like, this is a Helios Rings or Strobe Flash or whatever that card was from Gauntlet. Like, 4 mana tap 2, like, that's a much better interactive card than this. But as a Shield Blast, it has that duality where this card can give you the strong interaction still, but it's not too powerful of a Shield Blast. Like, it's just a Sun Shock coming out of your shields, which is fine, but it's not an amazing Shield Blast. So I think that really balances out the format and is like a really elegant design to go with the limited aspect of things. But Unfortunately, no one's really drafting this set, but I just wanted to address that quickly with these cards. Next up, we have Spark of Hunger. Not really interested in this. I'm like, for you to really leverage this card, your opponent has to have like a bunch of tap things that you couldn't already kill. I just don't really see the appeal. As far as I'm aware, there aren't really any like disgusting power-based combos. At least not ones that like buff all your creatures at the same time. I just don't really see the appeal to this kind of card. I don't think, like, historically, like, none of these bonus power cards have ever really seen constructed play. So, not really interested in that. Too situational, too conditional. Veil Rift is another card worth talking about. So, I guess there's two approaches to this card. So, first off, just looking at how it could slot into the existing metagame, I just don't really see it being or having application there. Like, one of the direct comparisons would just be something like Logo Scan, which is just 3 mana draw 2. Like, that card is already not really seeing too much play, and it's just a guaranteed +1. Veil Rift here could be better than that, but one of the problems with this kind of card is, like, I'd rather just take the 100% draw 2, because I feel like the some percent chance of being like a draw 3 or even 4, like, that bonus over the draw 2, like, draw 2 would have to be like like, in general, you'd have to have like minimum draw 2 off this card for it to be worth considering to begin with, for sure. But like, how much better the card gets when you hit 3 or 4 cards, I think is not as much of an increase as it is like a decrease when you only hit 1 card. Like, I think it's just so bad to hit 1 card, or so bad to hit 0 cards, especially, that it's like not worth like the odds of like maybe you hit 3 or 4 cards. So I think it's just, in general, I'd just rather take like the guaranteed +1 of Logo Scan if I'm playing a card like this in any of these kind of existing strong decks. Maybe that's wrong. Like, maybe this card, like, one of the other things to consider too is that one of the strengths of Logo Scan is like it's just a water mana. So a lot of decks like the Pile and maybe even like Light Water Fire Dragons, which are both decks that I've liked teching in like a copy of Logo Scan just because it gets me guaranteed extra land drops and card advantage. I've liked playing Logo Scan for a similar reason in Dragons, and that's a kind of a card slot that's had some precedent in tempo decks as well. It's just like the one of random Logo Scan was something popularized and utilized throughout a lot of Kaijudo's lifespan. And like, again, the guarantee +1, but also just out of Dragons especially, that extra water mana was really crucial. So Veil Rift being a light mana is kind of taking away from the card almost. But that said, like, it could be nice as just like an early card advantage card to dig for extra big dragons, but it doesn't really find any of the important stuff like Herald or Birds or anything like that. So I just don't really see the appeal to this card in the majority of existing archetypes. I think where I really would like to experiment with this card and where I see the most potential is just as a way to facilitate some more sort of, I guess, lower tier archetypes, like maybe combo decks revolving around 6,000 power or more creatures, where you can just assemble those combos by digging pretty deep through your deck trying to find those cards, or maybe abusing this card by just filling your deck with expensive or high power creatures and just adding a bunch of cards to your hand at once. Like, I think that's where you're just like really pushing this card and trying to abuse it to facilitate some more kind of degenerate things. So I don't really see this being like a super competitively viable card, but it could be like a really key enabler for some lower tier archetypes. Like, one of the interactions that I was kind of brainstorming was like something like Aeronautic Urgle, the 8k 8 mana card, but if you have 8 or more cards in hand, it can cost 0. So like, you could just have a bunch of those in your deck, and then you just Veil Rift, draw like 4 or 5 cards, and then just dump all your Aeronautic Urgles in play. That could be a really cool interaction. So that's the sort of stuff I might sort of look to doing with Veil Rift here. But like, trying to push those kind of synergies rather than focusing on it as just like a nice card to slot into existing archetypes here and there. Like, I just don't think, like, the bottom line is like Logo Scan got like pushed out of the format because it's just was a little, it just wasn't worth spending the mana on that kind of effect in the early game very much, and the type of game Kaijudo evolved into. And for the same reason, I just don't think Veil Rift is appealing for that either. I'd rather just play like more proactive cards in a lot of senses, unless again I'm playing those more degenerate kind of combo assembling type archetypes. I mean, this card is a light card, so it can go into more decks than Logo Scan would, just by default because of that, because light is so prevalent. It's a shield blast, so it alleviates some of that issue with Logo Scan, where it can be nice as just a card advantage card out of your shields that costs 0 mana. But overall, bottom line, I don't really think this is a too competitive card, unfortunately, given that like a lot of the competitive decks are on the more aggressive end of the spectrum. And this card is just not really something I'm interested in playing in those kinds of archetypes. So, the final card of light here is Volt Striker. So, I mean, we wouldn't have to talk about this too much, but it's a 3-drop Enforcer, 2500 power. When it attacks, clash with your opponent. If you win, one of your creatures gets plus 1000 power until end of turn, and untap it at the end of the turn as well. So, this card I don't think is particularly good. The only reason I would really discuss it to begin with is just because, again, I've been playing Monolite a little bit more recently, and one of the things I sort of discovered was like the 3-drop slot was pretty weak. Blinder Beetle is a fine card, especially because it deals with some of those like cards like Gloom Hollow and other blockers. It can push them out of the way for a turn, so it's a decent card. But Citadel Judge, I believe it's called, the 3-mana 2k that attacks and taps everything of a certain level. That card was sort of underperforming for me in a lot of times. Like, it's just a slow card. But I don't think Volt Striker is even an upgrade over that. I'd rather just play the Citadel Judge. Or even just forgo the 3-drop entirely and just play more 2-drops. I think that could even just be better. Just play more 2-drops so you never miss your 2-drop, and then you can go double 2-drop on turn 4 if you don't have an evolution or don't want to go that line. I think it's just better than playing like really mediocre 3-drops like Volt Striker. Yeah. Like when the effect is just basically like, it's relevant if you're staring down a situation where you might have to chump attack into your opponent's creatures, and then maybe you high roll and you can and then you get that chump attack for free without having to be attacked over. But a lot of the time I just wouldn't even make that play to begin with, right? Like if I'm just staring down a Swordhorn and I'm deciding whether I want to attack, and there's like a maybe 50% or even sub 50% chance if I'm playing like a rush deck like this that I win the clash, like I just might not even make that play to begin with, because a lot of the time, like the way you address those scenarios where you're kind of in spots where as a rush deck you have to chump attack in your opponent, is better to just build up a wider board so that they get less opportunities with their creatures to kill yours. So rather than just attack my 2-drop into your creature and then you get to kill my creature with your creature, and then I'll attack my 3-drop the next turn into your creature, and then you would untap and get to kill my creature again. Like, you're just, every single turn you're letting their creature kill one of yours. So it's better to just not attack and then wait till you have 2 creatures, attack with both, and then they can only kill one. And then generally that's like the kind of approach you take, or you wait until you have 3 and then they can only kill one, and then you get a little bit more attacks out of that in the long term. That's sort of one of the, right, because like if you attack with 2 and then you untap with 1, you get 3 attacks, as opposed to attacking with 1, it dying, attack with the other, it dies. Like, you're just getting 2 attacks. But if you wait, you can get like maybe 3, and then that principle kind of extends out to like taking those lines of play. So there might be some spots where you even attack with 2 creatures like that, and then Volt Striker might get you the ability to untap 1 and then save it. But if you're waiting to play around chump attacking, like, they're just going to attack over the other one anyway, so it doesn't actually really save a creature unless you're just chump attacking the one, which again is a play like I'm just not going to be, I don't even know if I'd make that play and take the risk. So just not really a card I'm into. These kind of untap effects are just not really particularly exciting. So yeah, that covers the light section, at least the rares through commons. So I think the most exciting cards here, I mean, Veil Rift is interesting for sure as like as a card to experiment with in certain archetypes. Hoverstar, I think, has some cool applications that I really like. And then Haven's Council would be maybe the most exciting in terms of cards I want to experiment with, but I don't think any of these cards really get there for me in terms of actual metagame. I don't think any of these cards are really strong enough to be mainstays. But those three cards, I think Haven's Council would be the one that's maybe has the highest potential, but at the same time, if it doesn't get there, it's just kind of falling off completely. Where Havoc Sphere and Veil Rift have probably higher floors, but I don't know if they're particularly good either. But those would be like the three cards out of light that are most intriguing to me from this set. But yeah, that will cover the first video here of the Eye of the Storm set review. So let me know what you thought about some of the cards here, my analysis of some of the cards, and I hope you'll look forward to the coming videos in the future. So thank you for watching as always, and we'll see you.